Good afternoon. I'll try to be brief, and I'd like to explain this. The introduction given was I started from humble beginnings. That is an overstatement of my family. I am the great-great-grandchild of immigrants to the U.S. who arrived in the country not speaking the language and with no money and basically no profession. And the fact that I was able to navigate the high-tech industry in the U.S. in the 60s forward is part of the miracle of America. I've got a somewhat heavy subject. I'm going to talk about death, transference, and life. And I'm doing this in order to explain something about my late wife and my late son. I'd like to ask you if you have any interest in who they were, walk by and look at their picture. A picture is worth 1,000 words. There's a story told in each of these pictures. I selected them personally because it tells the story about them. So let's talk about death to begin with, so I won't end there. The story actually starts before the death of my son. It's with the death of my brother. I actually had 3 brothers who didn't live and came before me. I'm the sole survivor of 4 sons, so you can imagine the grief of my mother. My brother lived to be 6 years old. He came down with cancer when he was 3. I was 8. And nobody knew what it was. They thought it was polio, and he had a low, slow glide to death, which I witnessed. We had no money, so we couldn't afford nurses and hospitals and nursing homes and care, so my mother was a nurse, and she deputized me to be assistant nurse because I was 8, 9, 10 years old, and she was trying to figure out what to do with me while she had a sick child to deal with. Now I bring this up because it ties to the death of my son. My son was 31 years old when he died. He was bipolar. He was fluent in Japanese. He started studying Japanese when he was 12. He was exceptionally bright, charismatic, much more outgoing. By the way, my younger brother was also more outgoing than I was. They're extrovert. Both of them were extroverts. I'm an introvert. And some people are so precious that they can't navigate in this world. And I would say that's the case with my late son. As I said, he lived in India. He worked in Cambodia with trying to dig up landmines. He lived in Japan for many years, and then he came back to the U.S. where he became a logotherapist. A logotherapist, for those of you who don't know, studies Frankl, the psychiatrist, which is basically to deal with your suffering, don't put it behind you or avoid it. And that David was like that. But if you are bipolar, you have to take medication to have somewhat of a normal life. If you take the medication, it does 2 things which are bad. One, it takes away your creativity. He couldn't live with that. And secondly, it renders you typically impotent. So he basically said he wasn't going to take drugs. I told him, you probably won't live. He said, rather than live taking the medications, I'd prefer not to live. And that's what happened. But if you see the picture of him, the reason why I wanted to point it out, he's surrounded by street urchins in India, where he went to work near the Ganges, and he lived in a guest house that was $30 a month for room and board. And he worked 1 day a week. He was a very unusual kid. He had a trust fund. He refused to take money, and he lived on what he could earn, which wasn't very much. My wife, my late wife, if you look at her picture as you go by, she is far different. She was elegant. She came from a family that was much higher class than my family. They were in the retail business. They had a store in Galveston, Texas. There were immigrants that came from Russia in roughly 1900. They formed a store, and they were the, quote, Neiman Marcus, which doesn't mean something. It means if you're from the U.S. or from the South, you'll know that Neiman Marcus is the Uber store. They had a small Neiman Marcus in Galveston, Texas. I met her in college. She was a sophomore. She dated somebody else when she was a freshman. I didn't like that person. It's not that I didn't like him because he dated her. I didn't like him. He was from Dallas, and I was from Fort Worth, Texas. We hated everybody from Dallas, and I particularly disliked him. And he's of blessed memory now, so I guess I shouldn't be so harsh. Anyway, I was dating. I was going to be a senior, and she was going to be a sophomore. And we had a mutual friend who was a sorority sister of my late wife. It was mutual. And the woman I was dating's mother decided that she should get engaged and we should get married, and told her that to tell me. Now, I don't know about you, for those of you that are single, but when a prospective mother-in-law tells a girl to tell the boy that you have to get engaged or you're going to break off the relationship, which is what the mother did, that was portents of the future. I was like a seer looking into the future saying, do I want this woman as my mother-in-law? No. And therefore, we got rid of her. And this intermediary, we didn't have email, we didn't even have cell phones in those days. We had tom-toms. We'd beat tom-toms, and we had smoke signals that we'd send. It was a primitive time. This is the 1950s. So she said, well, you should take out Marlene. I said, I don't like the guy she dated. Yeah, take her out. So I took her out, and we went to a very small dinner party with some other Fort Worth, Texas people we knew. And I can tell you what she wore. I can tell you what shoes she wore, what the color of her slacks were, what her sweater was, what her hair looked like. And I told her as we drove home that we would be married someday. First date. We were married 5 years later. There were intervening times. I wanted to get married. She wanted to go work for Jack Kennedy's campaign. She went off to be a politician, worked in the campaign. She was enamored with JFK. I went to the Army, served 2 years, and she was in California. Anyway, long story short, we came back together. Now, the reason why I give you this background is that she was the only woman I ever really got serious about, that I ever cared for, and therefore it makes it particularly difficult to deal with her death. Now, the thing I wanted to talk about was death, transformation, and then life. So what are the transformative things that happened? My brother died. My response to that death was I became the good son. Why did I become the good son? Because I didn't want my parents to suffer. So I was the guy who followed the rules. I always followed the rules. I was a hyper good student. I was a good athlete. I was a musician. I never created a problem. Now, in retrospect, I wonder what I'd have been like if my brother hadn't have died. I think he would have been a star, and I think I would have played second fiddle. That's what my guess is, but who knows? My son died in 1998. In 1998, I was at the peak of the power that I had in business. I was the CEO of a company. I'd made lots of money. People listened to me. I could go on TV, etc. And what did I learn from the death of my son, other than the death of a child? What I learned is you do not control life. And secondly, if you let life control you, you're in terrific trouble. Where did I learn that lesson? Sitting Shiva. I wanted to retire to my room and not come out when he died. And we had to come out to sit Shiva. Our family had not sat Shiva for 50 years before we sat Shiva. That was a powerful lesson for me. And at the time, I came to Israel after his death and studied for 8 weeks in the liberal yeshiva of HUC. They used to have a program that's somewhat like Pardes. And I studied tzedakah. And in studying it, I'm a systems engineer. I'm a very technical person. I need to understand details before I can understand the big picture. I studied agriculture, what was going on with the farming community, what obligations were there. And I came back and I completely changed my life. This is transformation. In changing my life, I stopped being the big executive. I was never in a corporation again. I made investments to make money, but not to keep money, to give to tzedakah. I created a foundation based on the principles of what I learned, following exactly the rules as I understood them. In the death of my wife, that was a much more difficult thing. She had won a triathlon in October of 2015. She won her age group of the 70s, men and women. She placed number 1. She was an incredible athlete. She was an incredible person, and she didn't feel well. She went to a doctor. I went with her. We listened. I heard the story. I knew immediately what the problem was. I knew she had cancer. Didn't come out, but I understood it. She was operated on, and guess what? She had exactly the same cancer my brother had, sarcoma. I know what the consequences of sarcoma is. There is no cure for sarcoma. She had ovarian sarcoma, he had neurosarcoma. So what did I learn? A second lesson, you can't control things. But what did I learn in the death of my wife? That you must live. Thank you.